Every great love begins with a single moment. Tonight, I'll share a story that will touch your heart and surprise you. Subscribe now, so you'll always be the first to discover the next unforgettable journey. On a crisp Monday morning in downtown Manhattan, the towering glass structure of Vance Global Enterprises shimmered in the pale sunlight, a beacon of wealth, power, and untouchable success. Inside its polished marble lobby, where even the faintest echo of footsteps carried a sense of purpose, the atmosphere was hushed with reverence for the man who sat at the very top. Leonard Vance, the young billionaire who had inherited his father's empire and turned it into an unstoppable machine, was known throughout the city as a man of sharp intellect and colder resolve. At 34, Leonard had the reputation of a strategist who could cut down competitors with a single decision, a king who saw no equal. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with steel-gray suits that matched the distant glint in his eyes. For those who worked beneath him, he was both feared and admired, though never truly understood. In a far less glamorous corner of that same company, tucked away in the research department on the 12th floor, sat Arya Tran. To the others in the office, Arya was simply another face, a young woman with long black hair that flowed softly over her shoulders, whose almond-shaped eyes seemed to look far beyond the sterile walls of her workplace. She spoke little, carried herself with quiet dignity, and had the habit of working late into the night when most of her colleagues had already gone home. Many dismissed her presence as inconsequential, a low-level researcher without any influence or ambition, a woman who blended too easily into the shadows of a building that demanded brilliance and loud achievement. Yet beneath her calm, unassuming exterior, there flickered a strength she kept carefully hidden, determination forged in hardship, and a mind sharper than anyone dared to guess. That morning, as Leonard prepared to face the board in a meeting filled with stern faces and the constant murmur of discontent, the company itself was already trembling under a silent storm. Weeks of strange errors, sudden leaks of confidential data, and inexplicable delays in major projects had begun to gnaw at the empire's iron walls. Outside investors were whispering, rivals circling like vultures in the sky, waiting for the moment when even the mighty Vance would stumble. Leonard, though calm in his demeanor, felt the weight pressing heavily on his shoulders. He could sense the betrayal brewing somewhere inside the organization, though the faces around him wore the polished masks of loyalty. On the 12th floor, Arya bent over her desk, reviewing yet another set of reports that had been brushed aside by her supervisor. There was something in the number's subtle inconsistencies that pointed to a larger pattern, like cracks in glass that could soon shatter. But when she tried to share her observations the week before, laughter had been her only reward. "Stick to your assigned work, Arya," they had told her, voices sharp with condescension. "Leave the serious analysis to the real players." She had smiled politely, hiding the sting, and returned to her seat. What no one knew was that Arya carried more history with this company than she dared reveal. For her, every line of data was more than numbers. It was a key to the puzzle she had been waiting years to unlock. The boardroom above buzzed with agitation. Leonard stood at the head of a long oak table, flanked by screens flashing red charts, declining stock values, and projections that smelled of catastrophe. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said in a voice steady as iron, "this company has weathered storms before, and it will not fall today." His words commanded silence. But beneath the surface of his calm, there was a flicker of something else, a quiet unease that no one dared acknowledge. His advisors whispered about sabotage, though none could point to its source. Leonard narrowed his gaze, determined to uncover the traitor who sought to bring him down. Downstairs, Arya straightened the papers on her desk, ignoring the snickers of her peers. She could hear the faint echoes of the boardroom tension through the building, as if the empire itself groaned under invisible pressure. She paused for a moment, pressing her hand gently against her chest, feeling her own heartbeat steady against the rising noise of panic. She knew what she had seen in the reports. She knew the danger no one else would admit. For a long time, she had kept her head down, hiding in the shadows of insignificance. But something inside her stirred, that quiet voice reminding her that she had not come here by accident. The story of Leonard Vance and Arya Tran did not begin with a grand introduction or an unexpected spark of romance. It began instead with silence, suspicion, and a quiet defiance. One was the king of steel and glass, who believed he controlled every piece on the board. The other was a forgotten figure in the back of the room, underestimated, overlooked, but carrying a truth that could turn the game upside down. As the city outside roared with the noise of ambition and greed, inside those walls, two destinies moved toward each other, not by choice but by an invisible force. Neither knew it yet, but the storm that threatened to destroy Vance Global Enterprises would be the same storm that brought their lives crashing together, setting the stage for love, betrayal, and redemption in ways neither could have foreseen. The boardroom on the top floor of Vance Global Enterprises was a cavern of tension that afternoon. Long shadows fell across the polished oak table, where 12 directors sat stiff-backed, their eyes fixed on screens that told a story of faltering numbers and shrinking confidence. The air was thick with whispered doubts, some directed at the market, some at their competitors, but most, though unspoken, pointed toward Leonard Vance himself. Leonard stood tall at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, his broad shoulders set like stone. His voice was calm, deliberate, slicing through the hum of conversation. "We are not beaten. The markets bend, they do not break. Not on my watch." His words demanded silence, yet the silence that followed was less respect than it was suspicion. It was at that precise moment that the door to the boardroom cracked open. A young woman stepped inside, clutching a small stack of papers to her chest. Her entrance was neither bold nor planned. In fact, it carried the clumsy urgency of someone who had been sent on an errand she did not choose. Arya Tran, the quiet researcher from the 12th floor, found herself in the lion's den. Behind her, a nervous assistant whispered, "Deliver these," before retreating hastily, leaving Arya alone under the weight of every gaze in the room. The directors exchanged looks of mild annoyance, some arching their brows at the audacity of a low-level staff member intruding upon sacred ground. One of them chuckled derisively, muttering, "Even the mailroom has better timing." The words carried across the table like a blade meant to wound. Arya heard it clearly, but did not flinch. She walked forward with quiet composure, her black hair catching the gleam of the overhead lights, her posture straight though her heart thudded against her ribs. She placed the documents gently on the table in front of Leonard, her eyes steady, her expression betraying neither shame nor apology. For a fraction of a second, Leonard looked directly at her. His piercing gray-blue eyes, accustomed to scanning reports and men of power, now met the calm fire of a woman the room deemed invisible. He saw no trembling, no flustered retreat, only an unyielding dignity that caught him off guard. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the moment was gone. Leonard lowered his gaze to the papers, flipping through them as though she were merely another courier in his empire. But something in his chest stirred a faint recognition of strength where he least expected it. The directors, sensing his lack of reaction, seized the opportunity to sneer. "Mr. Vance," one of them said dryly, "perhaps you should tighten security on who walks into these meetings. We wouldn't want trade secrets handled by unqualified hands." A few laughed softly, the kind of laughter meant to dismiss both Arya and, by extension, the discipline of Leonard's own staff. The young woman remained standing for a beat longer, her hazel-brown eyes scanning the room. Though she said nothing, her silence was not that of submission, it was the silence of someone who refused to be broken by mockery. Leonard noticed. He did not show it, but he noticed. He saw how she bore their disdain without shrinking. He saw how her presence unsettled them more than they cared to admit. And in that moment, he remembered her face. Arya turned and walked toward the door, each step measured, the echo of her heels firm against the marble floor. She knew what they thought of her. She had known it long before she entered that room. But she also knew something they did not. The paper she carried, the numbers she had reviewed, contained clues small, but vital off the hidden sabotage threatening to cripple the company. Her mind had already pieced together patterns the so-called experts had overlooked. She could have spoken then, in front of all of them, but she chose silence. Timing was everything. When the door closed behind her, Leonard returned his gaze to the board, yet his mind lingered elsewhere. The meeting dragged on with arguments, accusations, and hollow reassurances, but his thoughts kept circling back to the young woman's eyes. In a world where power was measured in money and authority, he had just glimpsed a force of another kind, quiet, unassuming, but unwavering. That evening, as the city skyline burned with the golden light of sunset, Leonard stood by his office window, looking down at the sea of traffic below. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, cold and composed as always. Yet beneath that surface, he found himself unsettled, not by the failing numbers, nor by the circling vultures of Wall Street, but by the memory of a nameless researcher who had walked into his boardroom with dignity that defied their scorn. For the first time in years, Leonard Vance felt the faintest crack in the armor he had built around his heart. Far below, in the quiet research floor, Aria sat once more at her desk, her colleagues gossiping carelessly around her, mocking the embarrassment of her intrusion. She ignored them, her focus fixed on the numbers before her. Her hand moved swiftly over the page, highlighting connections, tracing the outline of betrayal. She whispered softly to herself, "They think I am nothing. Let them think it." The fire in her eyes was hidden from the world, but it burned steady, ready to light the path ahead. And so, the story of their first collision was not born of romance, but of contempt, silence, and an unspoken recognition. Two lives, separated by walls of power and perception, had glimpsed each other for the first time. Neither spoke of it, neither admitted it, but the air between them carried a promise that their paths, however unlikely, were destined to cross again. And when they did, nothing within the empire of Vance Global Enterprises would remain the same. The days that followed were marked by unease, like the faint rumble of thunder beyond the horizon that no one dared to acknowledge. Vance Global Enterprises, once the unshakable fortress of commerce, began to show hairline fractures in its foundation. Memos circulated about unexpected delays in shipments, contracts that were inexplicably falling through, and whispers of confidential files appearing in the hands of competitors. In the gleaming halls of the skyscraper, polished shoes clicked against marble with a sharper edge. Voices carried an urgency tinged with fear, and behind every cordial handshake, there lingered suspicion. Leonard Vance, who had built his empire on control and foresight, found himself staring at walls that seemed to close in. He spent long nights in his penthouse office, reviewing page after page of reports, the skyline stretching endlessly behind him, lit like a crown of fire. He knew someone was tampering with his company from within, yet each lead dissolved into smoke, each suspicion turned against an innocent. The betrayal, he realized, was deeper, more insidious than he had imagined. Meanwhile, on the 12th floor, Aria sifted through numbers no one else cared to read. She noticed patterns, subtle at first, a series of small discrepancies in shipping manifests, financial forecasts that didn't align with real production output, contracts whose fine print carried language that favored outsiders rather than the company itself. To her colleagues, they were nothing more than clerical errors, routine blunders buried under the weight of larger crises. But Aria's instincts told her otherwise. She leaned over her desk late into the night, the glow of her computer painting her face in pale light, her eyes narrowing as she traced line after line. The inconsistencies formed a shape, a puzzle that only she seemed to recognize. Someone was guiding the company toward collapse, carefully, methodically, like a chess master sacrificing pawns before striking the king. At the executive level, tempers flared. Directors accused one another of negligence. Lawyers warned of lawsuits, and investors began to circle like sharks tasting blood in the water. Leonard stood at the center, composed as ever, but inside, his blood simmered. "We are being hunted," he admitted to himself in a rare moment of solitude. He had inherited enemies from his father's reign, competitors who never forgave the Vance family's domination of entire industries. But this attack felt different. It was not merely financial warfare. This was personal. Whoever pulled the strings knew the company intimately, knew its vulnerabilities, and struck with precision. One evening, after a particularly grueling board session, Leonard lingered in the empty conference. The city lights flickered through the glass walls, and his reflection stared back at him, sharp suit, steely eyes. But beneath the surface, the faint lines of a man carrying too many battles alone. His thoughts wandered unbidden to the young woman who had walked into this very room just days before. Arya Tran, a name most of the directors had forgotten instantly, yet one Leonard found himself repeating silently. There had been something in her ice and awareness, a strength that stood out against the polished arrogance of his inner circle. It disturbed him to remember her, but he could not shake the image. On the research floor, Arya was fighting her own private war. The more she uncovered, the more dangerous her position became. She knew if she spoke openly, her words would be dismissed, twisted, or worse, used against her. Already, she could feel the subtle hostility of her co-workers sharpening. Files went missing from her desk, whispered jokes followed her down the hallway, and her supervisor's eyes carried a warning whenever she lingered too long on topics that weren't her concern. Yet she pressed on, driven not only by curiosity, but by a deeper reason she kept locked inside. This company carried the weight of her family's past, a past scarred by betrayal and silence. To expose the truth now was more than a matter of duty, it was personal justice. The signs of sabotage grew bolder. A multi-million-dollar deal collapsed overnight without explanation. A shipment of critical components was rerouted to a competitor's warehouse, as if by invisible hands. Confidential blueprints appeared in the press, sparking rumors of incompetence. Each day, Leonard watched the empire he had fortified begin to crumble. But rather than retreat, he grew sharper, colder, his every word in meetings honed like a blade. Those around him saw only a man defending his crown. None realized he was preparing for a war he could not yet see the enemy of. On a rainy Thursday evening, fate aligned their paths once again. Leonard, walking through the lower floors unannounced, caught sight of Arya alone at her desk, surrounded by papers spread like battle plans. She did not notice him at first, so intent was she on her work. He lingered in the shadows, observing the determination etched on her face, the intensity in her eyes. She was no ordinary employee, he realized. There was purpose in her every movement, as if she bore secrets no one else could imagine. For a brief moment, Leonard considered stepping forward, asking what she had uncovered. But he stopped himself, retreating silently, leaving her in the glow of the lamplight. In the days to come, the company's crisis deepened, yet so too did the invisible thread that now bound Leonard Vance and Arya Tran. Neither spoke of it, neither sought it, but both could feel it, an unseen current pulling them toward a collision neither could avoid. For Leonard, the signs of danger marked the beginning of a war against shadows. For Arya, they marked the chance she had been waiting for all her life. And for both, though they did not yet know it, the storm that threatened to destroy Vance Global Enterprises would also forge the bond that would change everything they thought they knew about loyalty, power, and love. By the time the month drew to a close, the walls of Vance Global Enterprises were no longer whispering, they were shouting. Every corridor buzzed with rumors. Every department throbbed with unease. And in the grand boardroom, the directors were restless wolves tearing at scraps of blame. Meetings stretched into late hours, voices raised in accusation, and still the leaks, the failures, the inexplicable losses kept coming. Leonard Vance, standing tall before his restless empire, wore the mask of command as if it were carved into his face. His words were precise, his gaze unwavering, yet he could feel the tide pushing against him harder each day. He knew that somewhere, among the people who swore loyalty to him, someone was orchestrating his fall. He had the instincts of a hunter, but no prey revealed itself. Not yet. On the 12th floor, far from the gilded offices of the executives, Arya Tran hunched over a spreadsheet that others had dismissed as irrelevant. Her brow furrowed, pencil tapping softly against the desk. She followed the flow of numbers as one follows a hidden trail through the woods. Where others saw random errors, she saw deliberate design. A shipment that had been delayed 3 times matched perfectly with a sudden rise in a competitor's inventory. A contract clause, buried deep in legal jargon, handed subtle advantage to an outside investor. Piece by piece, she fit the puzzle together, her heart pounding as the image sharpened into something undeniable. The company was being hollowed out from the inside, and soon the collapse would be too vast to stop. Her supervisor brushed past her desk that evening, catching sight of the documents spread wide. "Still on that nonsense, Arya," he scoffed, his tone dripping with contempt. "You're wasting time. Do your assigned tasks. Leave the real analysis to the people who know what they're doing." His laughter drew chuckles from nearby desks, a chorus of mockery that had become routine. But Arya did not answer. She simply lifted her eyes, calm and steady, letting silence speak for her. It was not defiance loud enough to spark confrontation, but it was enough to mark her as different. They thought her meek. They thought her insignificant. They could not see the storm she carried inside. A week later, during a high-stakes strategy meeting, the company faced yet another potential disaster. A deal with an international partner teetered on the edge of collapse. Executives filled the room, voices clashing, throwing out solutions that sounded more like desperation than strategy. Leonard sat at the head, his jaw tight, his patience thinning. It was then that Arya, seated quietly in the back as an assistant's assistant, raised her voice. Soft at first, then steady. "The numbers don't add up because they're not supposed to. Look at the shipping logs. The same supplier appears twice under different names. They're funneling resources away from us. If you cut the deal now, you'll lose everything. But if you reroute through the secondary contract clause here," she moved swiftly to the projector, her fingers steady as she highlighted the overlooked details. "You can protect the company's assets and block their leverage entirely." The room fell silent. Directors exchanged startled looks, some scowling at the audacity of a low-level researcher interrupting their battle. Leonard's gaze, however, fixed firmly on her. He watched the clarity with which she spoke, the certainty in her tone, the quiet authority that no title had given her. And as the truth of her analysis unfolded on the screen, disbelief shifted to reluctant agreement. Within minutes, her suggestion was implemented. Hours later, the deal was safe. When the meeting ended, Arya returned to her seat, her face calm though her pulse raced beneath her skin. She gathered her papers silently, fully expecting reprimand, perhaps even dismissal for stepping out of line. But when she turned, she found Leonard Vance standing there, tall and immovable, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He spoke in a voice low enough only she could hear. "You saw what no one else did." It was neither praise nor gratitude, but acknowledgement, the kind that carried weight in a world where invisibility was the norm for someone like her. That night, as rain streaked down the windows of his penthouse, Leonard poured himself a glass of scotch and stood before the city lights. His mind replayed the moment in the boardroom, the quiet confidence of Arya Tran dismantling the arrogance of seasoned executives. He had underestimated her. Everyone had. And now, for the first time, he wondered what else she was capable of. He had built his empire on the assumption that he alone could read the board. But here was a woman with no power, no rank, who had shifted the game in a single move. Meanwhile, in her small apartment across the river, Arya sat with the same documents spread before her, illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. She knew the risk she had taken, speaking in that meeting. She knew eyes were now upon her, some with suspicion, some with resentment. But she also knew she could no longer remain in the shadows. The company was under attack, and she held pieces of the truth. Whether she wanted it or not, she was now part of the fight. She exhaled slowly, pressing her hand against the papers as if sealing her resolve. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. And so it was. In a world where power was currency and perception was everything, a hidden talent had been revealed. Leonard Vance, the unshakable titan, had glimpsed it. Arya Tran, the invisible researcher, had embraced it. The balance of their world had shifted ever so slightly, and though no one in the Empire yet understood, the true battle was about to begin. The weeks that followed Arya's revelation were unlike anything the company had seen in years. Her analysis had not only saved a crucial deal, but had earned her an invisible spotlight. She remained in her modest corner of the 12th floor, yet her name began to drift through hushed conversations in executive circles. To most, she was still that girl from research, but to Leonard Vance, she was something far more unsettling, an unknown variable in a game he thought he had mastered. He could not shake the memory of her standing before hardened executives, calmly dismantling a trap no one else had even noticed. It was not mere competence, it was instinct, the kind that came from more than training. Leonard, a man who trusted only in evidence, found himself haunted by questions. Who is she, really? One late evening, after another exhausting day of chasing phantoms through financial trails, Leonard asked his head of security to run a background check. He expected little more than a resume of a quiet employee, a woman of modest means and no connections. Yet what returned unsettled him. Arya Tran had been born into a family once closely tied to Vance Global itself. Her father, long gone from the public eye, had been a founding partner, a man whose name had disappeared from the company's history under mysterious circumstances. There were whispers of betrayal, a boardroom coup decades ago that had left her family ruined and erased from the annals of corporate glory. The deeper Leonard read, the more the threads tangled. Arya was not just another employee. She was the daughter of a man his own family had once buried in silence. That night, Leonard stood in his private office, the weight of the discovery pressing on him like a storm about to break. He stared out over the glittering skyline, glass of scotch untouched in his hand, remembering the cold lessons his father had drilled into him. Power is preserved by erasing those who threaten it. Was Arya here for redemption, or was she here for vengeance? The thought gnawed at him, turning admiration into suspicion, curiosity into caution. Unaware of the inquiries surrounding her, Arya continued her work with quiet determination. Yet she too felt the shadow of the past creeping closer. In the silence of her small apartment, she kept an old photograph tucked inside a drawer her father, standing with the original founders of Vance Global, his face full of pride, his hand resting on her shoulder when she was still a child. She remembered the fall that followed the whispers, the shame, the sudden exile. Her family name had been scrubbed clean from the company's records, her father's contributions forgotten as though they had never existed. For years she had carried the weight of that erasure, and now fate had placed her in the very heart of the empire that had stolen everything. One evening, while reviewing new reports, Arya caught Leonard watching her. He had walked the 12th floor quietly, as he sometimes did, moving like a shadow among employees who froze at his presence. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no mask of indifference in his gaze. He studied her with an intensity that felt like interrogation, though no words were spoken. Arya lowered her eyes to her work, but her chest tightened. She wondered if he somehow knew. Days later, Leonard summoned her to his office. The room, lined with leather-bound books and steel-framed windows, seemed built to intimidate. Arya entered with calm poise, her hands clasped lightly before her. Leonard gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "You've proven useful," he said at last, his tone even, almost cold. "But I don't trust what I don't understand. Who taught you to see what others miss?" His words hung heavy, an accusation veiled as curiosity. Arya held his gaze. "Sometimes," she replied softly, "it takes losing everything to learn how to see clearly." Her voice carried no tremor, no apology, only quiet truth. Leonard's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the silence stretched between them, filled with all the questions neither dared to ask aloud. He leaned back, studying her as one studies an opponent across a chessboard. That night, Leonard reviewed the old files again. The name of Aria's father glared at him from the pages, once a partner, then a rival, finally a ghost. His own family had erased the man, and now his daughter had returned, hidden in plain sight. It could not be coincidence. Leonard felt the past pressing against the present, the sins of his bloodline clawing their way back into his empire. Meanwhile, Aria's heart carried its own storm. She had not planned to be noticed, not this soon. Every step she took was supposed to be quiet, careful, her knowledge revealed only when the time was right. Yet fate had pulled her into the light. She knew Leonard suspected her now. She could feel it in the sharpness of his gaze, in the silence that lingered too long when their paths crossed. Still, she did not waver. She had entered Vance Global not merely to survive, but to uncover the truth and perhaps to reclaim the honor her father had been denied. So the stage was set, a billionaire scarred by power, a woman bound by a forgotten legacy, both circling each other with questions they dared not speak. To the outside world, Leonard Vance remained the unshakable titan, and Aria Tran remained the invisible researcher. But within the walls of that empire, the truth had begun to leak like water through cracked stone. The secret of her lineage, long buried beneath greed and ambition, was stirring to life again. And once revealed, it would test the boundaries of trust, loyalty, and the fragile thread of fate that had drawn them into each other's path. By early spring, the storm hanging over Vance Global Enterprises could no longer be dismissed as chance or misfortune. What had begun as minor disruptions had hardened into deliberate strikes, contracts stolen before signatures dried, shipments diverted to shadow companies, financial leaks timed with surgical precision. It was no longer sabotage whispered about in corridors, it was war. Leonard Vance, though calm to the eye, felt the pressure mounting with every sunrise. His empire was bleeding, and behind the veil of corporate warfare, he sensed the hand of a rival, one who not only wanted to cripple him, but to erase him completely. That rival revealed itself in fragments, first a name buried in old contracts, a familiar pattern in hostile bids, whispers carried by brokers who spoke only when paid in silence. The name was Harrington. Decades ago, the Harrington Group had stood alongside Vance Global as equals, but betrayal and ruin had cast them into the shadows. Now, they had returned with new wealth, new power, and an old thirst for vengeance. Leonard read the reports with a clenched jaw. It wasn't coincidence. The Harringtons had always hated his father, and if Aria Tran's family had been collateral damage in that long-ago feud, it meant only one thing: the enemy now sought to finish what had been left undone. In a dimly lit conference room, late one night, Leonard gathered his most trusted advisors. The air smelled of stale coffee and exhaustion, but the urgency burned bright. On the wall, charts mapped the encroachment subsidiaries quietly purchased by Harrington fronts, patents stolen before approval, loyal staff bribed to turn. "We're not losing by accident," Leonard said, his voice low and unyielding. "This is orchestrated. They know our weaknesses. They know us better than anyone should." His advisors shifted uncomfortably, reluctant to admit the truth. One dared to ask, "Do we have a traitor inside?" Leonard's silence was its own answer. Aria, though far from the upper ranks, was already uncovering pieces of the same puzzle. She stayed late in the research office, tracing shell companies that led like veins back to the Harrington name. Her pulse quickened as she realized the scale. These weren't random hits. It was an all-out campaign, and it was personal. She remembered her father's words, whispered years ago in the bitterness of exile. The Harringtons and the Van Cess will devour each other, and when they do, the innocent will be the first to burn. She had thought those words were the ramblings of a broken man. Now she knew they were prophecy. The next morning, Leonard summoned Aria once more. The board resisted why involve a mere researcher, but Leonard silenced them with a look. She arrived calm, though the weight in her chest felt like stone. In the boardroom, screens lit with evidence of sabotage, Leonard turned to her. "Show them what you found," he commanded. His tone was not gentle, but it was trust disguised as an order. Aria stepped forward. Her hands moved deftly across the files, her voice steady as she laid out the connections no one else had dared to see. These companies are shells. Their funds trace back to Harrington Group. They've bought influence inside our suppliers, redirected contracts, and positioned themselves to corner us in 3 markets at once. The sabotage is not random. It is deliberate, and it is aimed at destroying us. Her words cut through the haze of excuses like lightning. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then the directors erupted, voices sharp, some in disbelief, others in fear. Leonard raised his hand, silencing them. His eyes lingered on Arya. In her calm explanation, he saw more than intelligence, he saw courage. She was no longer invisible. She was standing where none had expected her to stand, and doing so with the authority of truth. Yet beneath his respect flickered unease. Her father's name still burned in his files, tied to both Vance and Harrington in ways too tangled to ignore. Outside those polished walls, the Harringtons moved openly now. Their executives smiled across dinner tables with investors, promising stability where Vance Global offered only chaos. Newspapers carried headlines predicting the fall of Leonard's empire. Stockholders whispered about transferring loyalty. The city, which once bowed to the Vance name, began to lean toward the rival it had nearly forgotten. That night, Leonard and Arya stood together in his office for the first time, the city's lights sprawling beneath them like a battlefield lit by fire. The air between them was taut with both unspoken trust and unspoken suspicion. Leonard broke the silence. They want me destroyed, but you have their map before they even move their pieces. How? His voice carried more than curiosity, it carried warning. Arya turned toward him, her face half in shadow, her voice soft but unflinching. Because I've lived with their destruction my whole life. They ruined my family once. They will not do it again. Leonard's gaze sharpened. In that instant, he realized the truth. He had feared. She was bound to this war not as an observer, but as one whose bloodline had already been scorched by it. For the first time in his reign, Leonard Vance understood he was not merely fighting a rival corporation. He was entangled in a generational feud, one that stretched back through betrayal and silence, one that would demand more than money, more than strategy. It would demand trust, and trust was the one weapon he had never learned to wield. Thus the enemy revealed itself, not only in the Harrington name, but in the shadows it cast upon every soul who bore its mark. And standing at Leonard's side was Arya Tran, the daughter of a forgotten founder, the woman with the fire of 2 legacies in her eyes. Together, they faced the truth the real war had only just begun. In the weeks that followed the Harringtons' open challenge, the halls of Vance Global Enterprises became a crucible. Every decision was life or death, every contract a battle. Leonard Vance worked relentlessly, his days stretching into nights, his voice sharp and precise in every meeting. Yet amid the storm, one presence began to carve itself into his life with surprising force. Arya Tran. What had begun as suspicion evolved into something far more complicated. She was not just the daughter of a man his family had erased, nor merely the researcher who had seen through sabotage. She was a quiet flame burning in the shadows, and Leonard found himself drawn to that light more than he dared admit. It began subtly, almost unwillingly. He noticed her calm resilience during late meetings when tempers flared. He noticed the way she never raised her voice, yet commanded attention with the clarity of her words. He noticed how she worked without seeking praise, her focus unwavering, as though she carried a private vow. Leonard, a man who trusted no one, began to trust Herat first with numbers, then with strategy, and finally with his silences. For a man like him, silence was the rarest gift. One evening, after a day of relentless confrontations with shareholders, Leonard returned to his office exhausted. He found Arya already there, poring over reports scattered like puzzle pieces across the table. She looked up, startled at first but did not rise. "I thought I might find the missing link," she explained, her voice soft but steady. Instead of reprimanding her for intrusion, Leonard stepped closer, scanning the papers. Their shoulders nearly touched as they leaned over the same document. the glow of the lamp wrapping them in a circle of quiet. For the first time in years, Leonard felt the press of time ease, replaced by something unexpected: companionship. In that moment, he studied her profile, the curve of her cheek, the intensity in her eyes, the quiet strength etched in her expression. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Most people in his world clawed for power or crumbled under its weight. Arya did neither. She stood steady, like a mountain refusing to bow to the storm. Leonard's chest tightened with a feeling he had long ago buried, a vulnerability he had sworn never to indulge. Arya, too, felt the shift. She had entered Vance Global with a mission, her heart guarded by years of silence and pain. Yet working beside Leonard, she saw a man not only of steel, but of shadow, carrying wounds invisible to the empire he commanded. She noticed the way his eyes softened when he thought no one was watching, the way he paused at windows as though searching for something beyond the skyline. She realized that beneath the armor of power was a man who bore the same loneliness she carried. Against her will, her heart began to turn toward him, not as the billionaire, not as the heir of her father's enemy, but as a man. Their bond deepened in late-night strategy sessions, in brief exchanges where words were few but meaning was vast. Once, as they reviewed files side by side, Leonard reached across the table to hand her a pen. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact, yet the silence that followed was charged, both of them aware of what neither dared to speak. The city outside raged with rumors of Vance Global's decline, and newspapers printed stories of Harrington's rise. Yet inside those walls, amid fear and suspicion, something rare bloomed. It was not a sudden flame, but a slow-burning fire, steady and undeniable. For Leonard, it was the first time in years he felt less alone. For Arya, it was the first time since her family's fall that she felt seen, not as a shadow of the past, but as herself. One night, when exhaustion had pulled the office into silence, Leonard lingered by the window, staring at the city lights. Arya stood beside him, her gaze following his. Without looking at her, he spoke, his voice low. "They want me broken. They won't succeed. But some nights, I wonder if it's worth the cost." Arya turned her head toward him, her voice soft yet unshakable. "It's worth it if you're fighting for more than yourself." Their eyes met, and for a long moment, the walls between them cracked. The next morning, Leonard walked into the boardroom with his usual composure, but something had changed. The directors still doubted, the numbers still bled, but his resolve was sharpened by more than duty. He now carried within him the knowledge that there was one person in this empire who stood beside him not for wealth or fear, but for truth. And Arya, sitting quietly in the corner with her papers, knew the same. Their love did not announce itself with grand declarations. It crept quietly, born in the trenches of survival, in stolen glances, in moments where silence spoke louder than words. It was the kind of love that grew not in gardens of peace, but in fields of battle. And though neither said it aloud, both understood in a war where enemies circled and betrayal lurked in every shadow, the most dangerous and the most precious thing of all was the fire kindling between them. The bond between Leonard Vance and Arya Tran had grown in secret, a flame burning quietly while the storm outside raged louder each day. In the world of power and empire, love was never safe. Betrayal crept, not from enemies circling beyond the walls, but from those who shared the same roof, the same table, the same false loyalty. It began with whispers Leonard could not trace. A missed call here, a misfiled document there, details that on their own meant little, but together formed a chain of unease. He felt it in the weight of certain stares during board meetings, in the silence that followed his words, in the hesitation of men who once obeyed without question. Someone close to him was no longer standing at his side. They were sharpening knives behind his back. The blow came on a Monday morning. Leonard entered the boardroom to find a thick file waiting at his place. Its contents were damning financial transfers suggesting mismanagement, confidential memos twisted to imply negligence, evidence fabricated but convincing it painted him as reckless, even corrupt. The directors, once merely uneasy, now stared at him with open distrust. "This cannot be ignored," one declared, his voice hard as stone. "The shareholders demand accountability." Leonard's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages. He knew these accusations were false, crafted with precision, but what chilled him was not the lies themselves, it was the access required to create them. Only someone inside, someone he trusted, could have assembled such a weapon. That night, Leonard sat alone in his office, the city lights flickering like distant embers. He poured a glass of scotch, but did not drink. His thoughts circled one name, one man he had called ally for years, Daniel Royce, his chief strategist. Daniel had been by his side through countless battles, advising, plotting, calculating. But in the past weeks, Leonard had sensed a change in him, hesitations too well-timed, questions that cut too deep, eyes that lingered too long on Arya with a kind of suspicion that bordered on envy. Leonard knew betrayal when he saw it, and the truth landed like a blade in his chest. Daniel, the man he had trusted like a brother, had chosen to side with the Harringtons. Arya discovered it differently. In the dim hours of the evening, she combed through encrypted files Daniel had thought safely hidden. She found the correspondence, the promises of power, the payment trails leading back to Harrington accounts. Her heart sank as she realized the depth of it. This was not just betrayal of Leonard, it was betrayal of every soul who worked in the company, every family that depended on it. Daniel wasn't merely switching sides. He was selling the empire piece by piece, and Leonard was the final offering. When Arya brought her findings to Leonard, he sat in silence for a long time. His eyes, usually cold and commanding, carried the heaviness of a man staring at the corpse of friendship. He closed the file slowly, his fingers steady though his chest burned with rage. "He was my right hand," Leonard said at last, his voice low, almost broken. "And now he puts the knife there too." He pressed a hand against his heart, as if to feel the invisible wound. Arya's gaze softened, her own heart twisting. She wanted to reach for him, to ease the weight, but she held back, knowing his pride would not yet allow it. The betrayal spread quickly. Within days, headlines splashed across newspapers, painting Leonard as a reckless heir unfit to lead. Anonymous sources Daniel's hand, guiding them, spoke of corruption and incompetence. Investors panicked, the stock plummeted, and the Harringtons seized the moment to step forward as saviors, offering stability in contrast to Leonard's supposed chaos. The empire trembled, and for the first time, Leonard felt the ground beneath him truly shift. Yet even in that darkness, Arya stood firm. When the board pressed Leonard for explanations, when the directors whispered about removing him, she rose from her seat and faced them. Her voice, though soft, cut through the room like a bell. "You believe lies because you want to, but lies cannot build empires, and truth cannot be erased forever." The directors scoffed, dismissing her as insignificant, but Leonard felt her words steady him. She had risked her own standing, her fragile place in the company, to stand beside him. In that moment, he knew she was no longer just an ally. She was his anchor. Still, the wound of betrayal bled. Leonard wrestled with anger and sorrow, haunted by the image of Daniel's smile, once a sign of loyalty, now a mask for treachery. He vowed silently that the Harringtons would not have the last laugh, nor would the traitor who sold his soul. But beneath that vow, deeper still, was another truth dawning on him in a world where trust had been shattered. The only light left was Arya. And so, as the empire staggered on the edge of ruin, Leonard and Arya found themselves bound closer than ever, not by choice, but by necessity. Betrayal had stripped away the illusions. What remained was raw, unyielding resolve and a fragile, dangerous love that neither enemy nor traitor could extinguish. The empire was crumbling. Headlines screamed of corruption, shareholders clamored for blood, and in boardrooms across the city, Leonard Vance's name was spoken not with fear and respect, but with doubt, suspicion, and scorn. The Harringtons, emboldened by Daniel Royce's betrayal, pressed their advantage like wolves closing on wounded prey. The board of Vance Global Enterprises, once unshakable in its loyalty, now wavered like reeds in the wind. And at the heart of it all, Leonard stood silent, his jaw set, his gray-blue eyes burning with the fire of a man surrounded by shadows. He had weathered storms before, but this one was unlike any other. This was not just a battle for profit. This was war against his very legacy, and it seemed the tide had turned against him. It was during a gathering of the full board, a meeting broadcast to shareholders watching from afar, that the decisive blow was meant to fall. Daniel Royce, his voice smooth and convincing, presented the so-called evidence of Leonard's mismanagement. He spoke with the confidence of a man who knew his lies had been carefully crafted, who knew the Harringtons waited outside the gates ready to seize control. For too long, Daniel declared, this company has been led by pride, not prudence. Leonard Vance has squandered what was built by his father before him. If we are to survive, we must act. The directors murmured, some nodding, others too afraid to meet Leonard's gaze. The trap had been set, and the noose was tightening. But before the motion could be called, before the vote to strip Leonard of his power could be cast, another voice rose. Arya Tran, seated at the back of the room as though invisible, stood and walked to the front. Her steps were steady, her face calm, though her heart thundered. She carried a single folder, thinner than Daniel's pile of forgeries, but within it lay the truth. Before you decide the future of this company, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, you deserve to see the full story. The directors shifted, surprised by the interruption, some sneering at the audacity of a low-level researcher speaking out. But Arya pressed on. With quiet authority, she laid out the trail of deceit financial records that revealed Daniel's secret dealings with the Harringtons, contracts he had redirected, payments that lined his pockets. She spoke not with anger but with conviction, her words striking like steady blows of a hammer breaking through stone. She revealed her own past, her father's name, the betrayal that had erased him from the company's history. I was told to stay silent, she said, her eyes sweeping the room. But silence is what allowed this rot to grow. Leonard Vance is not your enemy. The enemy is the man who stands among you, feeding your fear and selling your empire to the highest bidder. For a moment, the room was frozen. Then chaos erupted. Directors shouted over one another, some turning on Daniel with fury, others demanding proof. Arya placed the documents before them, each line a blade cutting through the lies. Daniel's face drained of color, his carefully composed mask cracking as the evidence mounted. He lashed out, shouting that it was fabrication, that she was nothing but a plant. But the truth was undeniable, the trail too clear, the betrayal too naked. Through it all, Leonard remained silent, his gaze fixed on Arya. She had risked everything, her position, her safety, her very futurito stand in that room, and speak the truth he himself could not. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had glimpsed the first day she walked into his boardroom, unflinching under scorn. And in that moment, admiration became something deeper, something unshakable. The board, rattled and divided, adjourned without a vote. Daniel was escorted out in disgrace, his shouts echoing down the marble halls. The Harringtons' plan, though not destroyed, had been delayed, their weapon blunted by one woman's courage. But Arya knew the danger was not over. If anything, she had painted a target on her own back. The Harringtons would not forgive her interference. Daniel, humiliated, would not rest. Yet she felt no regret. The truth had been spoken, and Leonard had been spared for now. That evening, in the quiet of Leonard's office, the storm outside the glass walls softened into rain. Leonard stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, the weight of betrayal and salvation heavy upon him. Arya entered, her footsteps soft, her presence calm. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then, turning toward her, his voice low but fierce, he said, "You risked everything today. You stood where no one else would." His eyes, usually cold as steel, now burned with something warmer, more vulnerable. "Why?" Arya met his gaze without flinching. "Because I could not watch them destroy you," she said simply. "And because this company's future should not be decided by lies. I had to protect the truth, no matter the cost." Leonard's chest tightened, his breath catching as the meaning of her words sank deep. She had stood not just for the company, but for him. In a world where loyalty was bought and sold like currency, Arya had given him something rarer than power sacrifice. And for the first time in years, Leonard Vance allowed himself to feel what he had always feared most: trust. The rain beat softly against the glass, the city glowing beyond, but inside that office, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. One, a billionaire scarred by betrayal; the other, a woman who had risked everything to shield him. The storm was far from over, but in that moment, they both knew together they could endure what was to come. And if love was born anywhere, it was born here in sacrifice, in courage, and in the unshakable bond forged by fire. The storm that had threatened to tear Vance Global Enterprises apart began to settle, though the scars it left behind were deep and unignorable. The Harringtons had retreated, their schemes damaged but not entirely defeated, and Daniel Royce's betrayal had been laid bare for all to see. For the first time in months, the boardroom was no longer a battlefield, but a place of reckoning. The directors, their pride wounded, now looked to Leonard Vance, not with suspicion, but with reluctant respect. He had survived the storm, yet everyone in that room knew it was not Leonard alone who had carried the empire through. It was also the woman who stood quietly at his side, the woman who had risked everything to reveal the truth. Leonard rose before the board, his tall frame casting a shadow across the long oak table. His voice, steady and commanding, broke the silence. "Vance Global has been tested," he said, "tested by greed, betrayal, and the weight of our own history, but still stands, not because of wealth, not because of power, but because of those who refuse to let truth be buried." He turned slightly, his eyes resting on Arya Tran. For a moment, the directors followed his gaze, their faces tight with discomfort, perhaps even guilt. They had dismissed her as invisible, unworthy of notice. Yet it was her courage that had saved them all. The vote to retain Leonard as CEO was unanimous, though it came more from necessity than loyalty. Shareholders were informed, the markets stabilized, and the headlines began to change. What had once been predictions of collapse turned into stories of resilience, of a company that had stared down ruin and emerged stronger. Yet Leonard knew the war was not over. The Harringtons would return. The shadows of his family's sins would resurface. But now he was not alone. That evening, when the building had emptied and the city outside glowed beneath a veil of twilight, Leonard found himself once again in his office. The storm clouds that had hung over him for so long seemed to have lifted, though the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on his shoulders. Arya entered quietly, carrying no papers, no reports, only her presence. For the first time, she did not stand as the unseen researcher or the hidden daughter of a forgotten founder. She stood as his equal, her gaze steady, her spirit unbroken. Leonard turned toward her, the hard edges of his expression softening. "You saved me," he said simply. His voice was not the voice of a CEO or a titan of industry. It was the voice of a man stripped of pretense, speaking truth. "You saved more than the company. You saved me from myself." He paused, searching for words he had never spoken aloud. "For years, I believed trust was weakness. I believed loyalty was a mask waiting to fall. But you proved me wrong." Arya stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You weren't wrong to be cautious," she said softly. "You've lived in a world where trust is dangerous. But sometimes it is the only thing that gives us strength." She reached out, her hand brushing his, a gesture both tender and powerful. For a man who had built walls higher than skyscrapers, the touch was like sunlight breaking through. For a long time, they stood together by the window, watching the rain-washed city glisten under the streetlights. Neither spoke, for words were no longer needed. In that silence, they understood what had been forged between them: not a love born of convenience or desire, but a bond tempered in fire, in betrayal, in sacrifice. It was the kind of love that could not be shaken by power or pride, the kind that would endure when storms returned. In the weeks that followed, Leonard began to reshape the company. Transparency replaced secrecy. Collaboration replaced suspicion. He invited Arya into the inner circle, not as a token, not as a symbol, but as a partner. Her insights became invaluable. Her presence a constant reminder that strength was not found in fear, but in trust. The directors, though hesitant, could not deny the results. Slowly, even they began to respect the woman they had once scorned. Arya, for her part, found peace in reclaiming her family's place in history. She did not seek titles or glory, but in quiet moments, she would glance at the old photograph of her father and whisper, "We are remembered now." The past no longer weighed on her shoulders like chain. Instead, it guided her forward. And so, from the ashes of betrayal, a new beginning took root. Leonard Vance, the titan once defined by solitude, had found not only a partner in business, but a companion in life. Arya Tran, once invisible, had become the voice of truth that reshaped an empire. Together, they stood not as heirs of the past, but as architects of the future. The city below roared with its endless noise, indifferent to their struggles. But in that high office, something quiet, something enduring had been born. And though neither knew what storms the future might bring, they knew this whatever came, they would face it side by side. For in a world ruled by power and greed, the greatest strength of all was not wealth, nor legacy, but the unyielding bond of trust and